I'm one of the people who helps organize these seminars, Rupa. So I just wanted to get started. Chris Pettit's actually going to do the intro for our speaker today, but I'll do some of the housekeeping. First, I want to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the lands of the Darug people. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I think for me as a built environment professional, where I'm in my work trying to be mindful of people and histories of the land, it's good to keep in mind that sort of attention to place has been a part of Australian history for millennia. So with that, I just want to do a quick bit of housekeeping, mainly for the people online. If you can mute your microphone and turn off your camera during the presentation, feel free to turn that back on when we get to the Q&A. If you want to put in questions as we're going along, feel free to put that in the chat. Rupa is monitoring that so we can track your questions for the end. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Chris Pettit, the Director of City Futures, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Lee. My great pleasure to be here at our new Parramatta Innovation Hub. For those who are joining face-to-face, it's a brand new facility that we have at UNSW in Parramatta, and we have it set up. For those who've been to the City Analytics Lab, we're not going to be using all the tech in the space, but it's set up to support workshops and engagements. So hopefully you have the opportunity to come and visit our new UNSW space in the not too distant future. It's also available for staff and students to drop in and work. So any staff and students who are online who live near Parramatta, you're able just to turn up here, rock up and plug in and away you go. So I'm introducing Will Thackway today and his research. So Will is a HDR student with us in the centre. So he's completing his Masters of Philosophy. It's a piece of work, fascinating piece of work, looking at data-driven approaches, looking at machine learning and AI, focused predominantly on gentrification. But this is a side piece of work, very interesting side piece of work that really, Bill Randolph, I can see your dot online. You should be here introducing Will around this piece of work. But he's been working very closely with Bill on this. Henry's also contributed, and myself in a very small amount of thinking on this particular piece, but it's very topical with COVID and trying to understand. We've got so many fluctuations occurring with the property market, whether it's looking at housing fluctuations in property prices. Now we're seeing interest rates rocketing up. And what does it mean for the rental market? And what does it mean for those out in regional areas? So Will's going to unpack some of his research looking from Bondi, what's happening in Sydney, out to Byron Bay. So I'll hand you over to Will.
Beautiful. Thanks, Chris. So I'd just like to extend that acknowledgement of country and say pleasure to be meeting here on the land of Darug people in this new UNSW office, and pleasure to be presenting to all of you guys today. Today my name's Will. I'm doing my MPhil. I was a full-time MPhil student last year. I'm now working at a consulting company, and I'm finishing off my MPhil part-time. But yeah, as Chris said, this is a piece of work that was not related to my MPhil that I did with the help of Bill, Henry, and Chris. And it's basically looking to compare, as the name suggests, the urban and regional rental prices or rental markets during the COVID pandemic, looking kind of from the start of the pandemic to about mid-2021, which is when we finished this study. And yeah, I'll be going over that study today. If you could move the next slide. All right, great. So today I'll start with a bit of an introduction to the sort of COVID-related literature around some trends with relation to migration and rental markets, both at Australia and abroad during the pandemic. I'll then introduce the motivation for our study and some of the methods and data that we looked at before going into the analysis. So the analysis starts off with a bit of a broad overview of the trends in both urban and regional markets over the whole of New South Wales. I'll then take a bit of a closer look at Airbnb in the rental market, exploring some of the relationships there. And then after kind of taking that macro view, I'll have a bit of a more local micro view at two particular case study markets, the namesake of the study, Bondi and Byron Bay. And then finish off with a brief look at some analysis of investor activity and how this has kind of been linked to the rental market and the housing market before finishing off with some conclusions and implications. Okay, so, next slide. So starting off with some of the literature around some of the broad trends of the housing market during COVID. Firstly, I'd like to start with a little bit of talk around migration. So there are kind of two main trends identified for international migrants and regional areas. So obviously with the shutdown of global travel, there were some major impacts on international migration to Australia. Borders shut to Australia on March the 20th of 2020. And immediately following that, we can see that total international arrivals fell from over 2 million in January of 2020 to about 2,000 by April of 2020. That recovered somewhat to about 270,000 by January 2022, but obviously still down a significant amount. There were two kind of main areas where that affected. So firstly, tourism. Between January 2020 and April 2020, international tourists contracted by 99%, and students as well. Between January 2020 and January 2021, international student intake fell by 93%. And this primarily affected urban areas because urban areas are generally more of a focus for international tourists, also where universities and other education hubs are centred, so more of a focus for students. And there was also, of course, the impact on international migrant workers who tend to more closely cluster in cities as well. So a big impact on cities there of the changes in international migration. For regional areas, on the other hand, there was sort of a push in the opposite direction. So you had a bit of an exodus from the major cities due to lifestyle factors and tourism factors. So people moving to regional areas in search of greater space, greater access to the outdoors, greater access to amenities. And you also had greater domestic tourism as international borders were shut. So once we had the reopening of borders or state borders following the lockdown easing, there was a big push towards the regions, and we saw that in both in both Sydney and Melbourne, over 8,000 people. There was a net migration loss of over 8,000 people in those major cities. So two kind of contrasting migration trends for cities and regional areas. And how this kind of flowed onto the rental market, again, kind of contrasting impacts in both regional and urban areas. So in urban areas, one of the first phenomenons that was studied around the world was what they called the inner city donut. So this was particularly studied in London, several American cities. And that was kind of as I was talking about, the exodus of people from inner city areas, students, tourists, international migrant workers, as well as people leaving for lifestyle regions, which meant that you had a massive decline in rental prices in inner city areas. But then the other part of that donut is you actually had a bit of an increase in rental prices in the suburbs, where there was a kind of suburbanization trend occurring, where people were moving to the suburbs for those lifestyle reasons. Another big trend, obviously, was the decline of Airbnb with the massive hit to international tourism. And there were several studies studies focused in Sydney and Hobart, which looked at the decline in rental prices in high Airbnb activity areas. In regional areas, on the other hand, as mentioned previously, there was both the lifestyle attraction and domestic tourism bumps, which meant that you had regional areas in a number of different places around the world experiencing rental price increases. So the literature from a number of different studies from different countries around the world, particularly focused on the UK, the US and Europe, kind of documented these contrasting movements between urban and regional rental prices. However, they were generally done in a kind of patchwork way where you had individual studies looking at city areas, individual studies looking at regional areas. There wasn't really many studies that we could find that actually looked to directly compare a commensurate urban and regional rental market. And that was kind of the aim of our study. So if we go to the next slide, the main motivation of our study was just to get a commensurate urban and regional rental market and then directly compare them so that you've got a bit of a control and so that we can kind of contrast those responses. So that was the motivation for the study. The methods that we took, it was very much a data analysis motivated approach. So we weren't intending to do any sort of causal analysis, any rigorous statistical analysis. It was more intended to be a bit of a descriptive analysis of the broad trends that we saw, trying to bring out some of those trends and then look at potential policy implications of that. So I'll go over some of the different data analysis methods we used in each of the sections, but it was mostly kind of tables, graphing, some maps. The different data sets we used property data from the Australian Property Monitors, which gave us rental prices, property prices. We used Airbnb data from the web scraping company, AirDNA, which contains the location, price, number of bookings in a year of Airbnb listings. We took rental vacancy rates from the Real Estate Institute of New South Wales, which have their own sort of predefined areas for vacancy rates. And then we also took dwelling counts from the New South Wales Valuer General all property data set, which came into our investor analysis at the end. Next slide. And this is another, so I'll just introduce this as well for the purpose of kind of investigating different periods in New South Wales timeline of lockdown and reopening. We use these three study periods as kind of three different distinct points in New South Wales COVID timeline. And we use these for a number of different periods of the analysis. So the first period there between the end of 2019 and start of 2020, I'll just move out of the side there, sort of represents the pre-COVID period. So it's a bit of a control period before any of the effects of the pandemic were being felt. Then the first period there in the middle of 2020 represents the immediate response to the pandemic as New South Wales went into its first lockdown, and we saw the sort of shock effect on housing markets and the economy. And then towards the end of 2020, start of 2021 was the start of the recovery period as lockdowns, as the first lockdown ended, state borders started to reopen, and we started to get the recovery of some of those economies, housing markets, tourism, and so forth. Okay, so starting with just a bit of a broad overview of the rental market trends, we've got here the blue line represents Greater Sydney, which effectively acts as our urban market. The orange line represents the rest of New South Wales, which acts as our regional market. And this is just a very simple graph looking at median rental prices between the start of 2019 and midway through 2021. And we've got those three periods there. So you can see for Greater Sydney, rental prices were initially softening prior to the pandemic. And while they were initially stable in response to the pandemic in the middle of 2020, they started to dip quite strongly into 2020, and they continued to fall into 2021 as there was vacancy rates increased. We had the loss of domestic tourism, international migrants, so on and so forth. For the rest of New South Wales, on the other hand, rental prices were initially stable prior to the pandemic. They dropped ever so slightly after the pandemic hit, but then into that sort of recovery period, we see that they spiked quite significantly, and that increase continued on into the middle of 2021. So just on a very basic level, we can start to see that the rental market responses of Greater Sydney and the rest of New South Wales are starting to contrast each other. And that's reflecting some of those those lifestyle, tourism, and other pressures that we were talking about previously. If we go to the next slide, this is starting to look at the sort of geography of the spatial distribution of these changes. And this is just a simple map where we've got between the two periods, we have blue representing declines in rental prices and orange representing gains in rental prices. And we can start to see here a bit of the formation of that inner city donut that was spoken about previously. So you can see that several inner city areas like the Sydney CBD, Bondi, Manly experienced quite significant rental price declines in both of the two periods, whereas places, suburbs on the outer of Sydney City were stable or started to experience rental price increases. So that's starting to get that inner city donut effect that we were talking about. And interestingly here, you can see that generally speaking, places in Sydney which are higher price areas were the areas which were actually most affected by the pandemic in terms of rental price declines. In the rest of New South Wales, on the other hand, we get quite a different picture. So in the left here, in the immediate aftermath to the pandemic, rental prices increased somewhat, but were generally stable, but then they kind of exploded into 2021. And in particular, coastal tourist areas and regional amenity areas were the places where prices increased the most. So some tourist spots like Byron Bay, Coffs Harbour, South Coast increased quite significantly. And then we've also got rural amenity tree change locations like Mudgee, Bathurst, the Southern Highlands, which increased significantly as well. And so here, contrary to Sydney, we can see that generally higher price areas were the places where rental prices increased the most. So again, quite a clear contrast between the urban and regional rental markets. So that's the broad rental market trends. We'll now go into a bit of a deeper dive analysis on the relationship, if any, between short-term rental market and the long-term rental market. So to do this, I've constructed a very basic measure here of Airbnb activity in an area. So at an SA2 level, what we did is we took this Airbnb share, which is effectively the proportion of houses in an SA2 area that are listed as Airbnbs. And so that goes right up to about 20% in the highest areas around Bondi. So using that Airbnb share measure, we split every SA2 area into deciles based on their level of Airbnb activity. So areas in decile 10 were the highest level of Airbnb activity, and areas in decile 1, the lowest Airbnb activity. So this is just a graph here of quarterly Airbnb activity by those deciles. We can see in Sydney, the blue represents prior to the pandemic and orange after the pandemic. So Airbnb activity was increasing slowly in Sydney prior to the pandemic. You get a bit of a drop off in the first quarter of 2020, and that's generally happens after the Christmas sort of rush. But then you can see a massive decline immediately after the pandemic hits, and that continues on into 2021. In regional areas, on the other hand, we see a similar trend prior to the pandemic, that big drop off immediately after the pandemic. But you can see that Airbnb recovered very quickly, and it actually surpassed pre-COVID levels in some areas. So we can see immediately there the differing responses of the tourist market to the pandemic in urban and regional areas. This is now starting to look at how those Airbnb numbers flowed on to the long-term rental market. So here again, we've got Airbnb share on the bottom of the x-axis here, and on the y-axis we've got long-term rental supply change. So that's measuring the total number of long-term rentals and the change in long-term rental supply between each of the periods. So if we start in the Greater Sydney area, we can see that there's a clear increasing trend here of long-term rental supply with Airbnb activity here. So for most areas, we can see a drop-off in long-term rental supply immediately following the pandemic, and that's presumably due to people, some landlords moving back into their rentals, people generally taking rentals off the market due to the unstable economic conditions. However, you can see in the most active Airbnb neighbourhoods in decile 10, there's actually an increase in rental supply. And what the theory is there is that as Airbnbs or as tourist activity dropped and Airbnb is no longer a stable revenue earning option, Airbnb landlords may have converted their Airbnbs back to the long-term rental market in search of that greater security of rental revenue. And hence you see that increasing trend. Into the period 3, which goes into 2021, you see that trend's somewhat reversing, but it's not really a clear trend there for Sydney. In the rest of New South Wales, on the other hand, we see a similar kind of increasing trend immediately following the pandemic, but it's nowhere near as distinct as Greater Sydney. But then into period 3, when we had the rebound of tourist activity, we can see that trend actually completely reverse, and it's quite significantly, it's quite clear that we've got a decreasing trend there in the rest of New South Wales with Airbnb activity. So the theory here is kind of the opposite to Greater Sydney, where we have tourist activity rebounding. There's a greater incentive for long-term rental landlords to actually convert their rentals to Airbnbs so as to capitalise on that greater revenue earning potential of Airbnbs, given they command a far higher nightly rate. So again, Greater Sydney compared to rest of New South Wales, we're seeing a contrasting trend in terms of rental supply by Airbnb activity. If we go to the next slide now, this is kind of a similar viewpoint of Airbnb and rental supply, but just from a slightly different angle. So we're now comparing Airbnb to vacancy rates. The reason I've got these geographical areas here is to align with the Real Estate Institute of New South Wales, who has these predefined geographical areas they look at. So in Sydney, we've got inner Sydney, middle Sydney and outer Sydney. And I just reconstructed those areas using the local council areas that are in each of those. So you can see here, firstly, in terms of Airbnb share in Greater Sydney, it's pretty well constant for middle and outer Sydney, where there's not too much Airbnb supply. But for inner Sydney, taking into account those seasonal inclines, we see a clear decreasing trend in Airbnb share over the time period, which is to be expected, and it goes down by about 2% from the peak at the start of COVID down to the middle of 2021. The effect on vacancy rates is actually quite clear here. So you can see that where Airbnb share dropped by 2%, for inner Sydney, vacancy rates have increased by about 2% over the same time period. And again, the theory is here as Airbnbs were being converted back to long-term rentals, given that there was there was less tourist activity, you have more supply in the long-term rental market and hence higher vacancy rates. For the rest of New South Wales, we can see again Airbnb share after the initial drop-off of COVID started to recover and actually surpass the pre-COVID levels, particularly for some of the more hotspot areas like the Northern Rivers and the South Coast. And here we see that relationship to vacancy rates, but in the opposite direction. So vacancy rates fell quite sharply for all regional areas that we looked at, and they were below 1% for all of those regional areas, which again, presumed relationship there is more Airbnbs put on the market, less long-term rental supply, and hence decreasing vacancy rates. If we go to the next slide now, starting to look at how this flows onto rental prices. It's a very similar graph to what we had previously, where we've got Airbnb share on the bottom, and we've got median rental price change on the y-axis. So firstly in the Greater Sydney graph that we saw on the top left, previously we had an increasing relationship of rental supply with Airbnb activity. Now we've got a decreasing relationship of long-term rental price with Airbnb activity, which which intuitively makes sense when you just think about basic supply and demand mechanics. So given that in the most active Airbnb areas we had an increase in supply, we would expect that there would be a decrease in rental price. Into 2021, we can see that this trend is still apparent for Sydney. So there was still that trend of decreasing rental prices in the most active tourist hotspots in Sydney. In the rest of New South Wales, we see a sort of mixed trend for the first period, but into the second period there, we see quite a clear increasing trend of rental price with Airbnb. Which again mirrors the decreasing trend in supply that we saw previously, indicating that where Airbnb activity is increased, so too has rental supply. So again, for all of these, for all of the sort of evidence we've had here, it's not necessarily evidence of a causal link between Airbnb and rental supply and rental prices. However, there is a strong indication of some sort of a relationship. And importantly, that relationship seems to be symmetrical. So in Sydney and regional New South Wales, where we've had differing Airbnb trends, we can see that there seems to be a relationship with rental price, whereby when we have increasing Airbnb activity, we seem to have increasing rental prices, and vice versa for decreasing Airbnb activity. So those were the broad kind of rental market trends and a comparison of urban and regional areas. This now is a examination of those trends on a more micro scale, and we're looking at two areas here which kind of exemplify two of the most popular tourist spots in New South Wales in the eastern suburbs, with some iconic spots like Bondi, Bronte, Paddington, and then the Northern Rivers area in northern New South Wales with Byron Bay and other very popular areas around that spot. So we can see here that those macro trends have absolutely played out on a micro level, and it's quite a clear difference in trends here. So in the eastern suburbs, we can see a clear drop off in Airbnb share following the start of the pandemic, and that's continued on into 2021. And the particularly strong, and then when we move into median rental price, we can see that it's fallen for all areas in the Greater Sydney, in the eastern suburbs area, particularly strong for Paddington, where you had sort of the Airbnb impact probably compounded by there's also a greater population of students and migrant workers in that area. And we can see that for most areas that's continued on into 2021, with the exception of some of those more coastal areas around the beaches, and particularly pronounced again in Paddington. In the Byron Bay region, on the other hand, while we had the initial drop-off in Airbnb activity, that soon recovered into 2021, and we can see that pretty well reflected in rental prices. So rental prices initially dropped or were kind of stable, but then boomed into the start of 2021. And we see those huge rental price increases up to 35 and 45% in Byron Bay and Brunswick Heads. So this is very much an indication of those macro trends playing out on a micro scale, and two very high profile areas having markedly different responses in terms of the rental market to the pandemic. If we go to the next slide, this is just sort of more of a graphic illustration of what we saw there. So we've got the orange lines representing long-term rental supply and the blue lines representing long-term rental price. We can see that for the eastern suburbs, rental supply initially increased as we had lower Airbnb activity, more long-term rentals hit the market. That's been declining slowly, but the rental supply is still above where it was prior to the pandemic. Prices, on the other hand, have dropped significantly following the start of the pandemic and have slowly been recovering, but are still below their pre-COVID levels. In the Northern Rivers area, on the other hand, we also saw a spike in rental supply, but that quickly fell off as the presumed long-term rental supply was converted to Airbnbs to cater for that greater tourist demand. And then rental prices, while initially falling somewhat, have continued to increase and are well above what the rental prices were pre-pandemic. So again, that's just another illustration of those diverging pathways for urban and regional markets. So those were purely focused on the rental markets. This next section here starts to bring in some of the property market dynamics that we saw as well by looking at rental yields and how these have interacted with investor activity. So starting here, looking at rental yields, we've got median weekly rental price, but then that was calculated later at an annual level, and median house prices, then calculating the rental yield as median annual rent divided by median house prices. So we can see that for Sydney, where rental yields were already quite low prior to the pandemic, they dropped even further as you had decreasing rental prices and increasing housing prices, and they've dropped by sort of at least 0.3% in all of the areas that we've selected here, which is some sort of high profile areas in the Sydney region, and falling rental yields in both of those two periods looked at. For the regional areas, on the other hand, where rental prices were initially stable, but then started to increase towards the end of 2020, start of 2021, housing prices were increasing the entire time. So the effect on rental yields was that rental yields were initially kind of stable or falling, but recovered quite quickly towards the end of 2020 and overall kind of stabilised after that initial drop-off. If we go to the next slide, this slide now looks at how those changes to rental yields started to affect investor sentiment and investor decisions. So we've created here a measure of investor purchasing by looking at all properties that were bought in a particular period, and any property that was bought in a particular period that was then listed as a new rental in the preceding period was assumed to be an investor purchase. So for example, if you've got a property that was bought in period 1 before the pandemic, if it was then listed in the next 6 months, it was presumed to be an investor purchase of a property. If we look at Sydney, first of all, we see that investor purchasing fell quite significantly immediately after the pandemic, and didn't really recover into the second period there. So as we had declining rental yields, we saw that generally reflected in declining investor purchasing of property. In regional areas, on the other hand, we had rental yields initially falling off, and that's reflected generally in a fall off of investor purchasing. But then as rental yields rebounded, we can see that investors came back to the market and bought at a higher rate of there was investor purchasing at a higher rate in all areas bar one than there was prior to the pandemic. So again, while this analysis doesn't draw any causal links between rental yields and investor purchasing, there again seems to be quite a distinct relationship between rental yields and how that's flowing onto investor activity that is evident in both directions and in contrasting directions for urban and regional areas. So if we go now to the conclusions and implications of the paper, reflecting again that while we're not trying to prove causal links in this, there have been some quite strong relationships and pause for thought on what these relationships reflect and how they've been contrasted and how that may flow onto potential policy implications. So the first one there is the first finding of the paper is looking at Airbnb's impact on rental prices. Crucially in this paper, whereas previous studies have looked primarily at the impact of increasing Airbnb activity on rental prices, this is one of the very first studies to look at the opposite effect where Airbnb activity decreases. And that's particularly prominent in the face of Airbnb regulation, which which generally tries to reduce the total supply of Airbnb in the market. So the finding that when Airbnb activity decreases, there seems to be a relationship that rental prices also decrease is quite an important one in the context of that Airbnb regulation. When we think of Airbnb regulation in Australia, it tends to follow the route of trying to reduce the total number of bookings that an Airbnb is allowed to be listed annually. In in Sydney, we have a 180-day limit on the total number of annual Airbnb total number of annual days for an Airbnb to be listed. And interestingly, recently, Byron Bay has tried to introduce a 90-day annual limit for Airbnb listings. That was introduced in June of 2022. That's still going through local council, so we'll see whether that gets through. The second major finding of the paper is indicating how housing submarkets have distinct dynamics and really challenging the idea that the housing market is sort of moves as the one moving beast. So we saw, as mentioned previously, that the short-term rental market and long-term rental market function with distinctly different dynamics. We also saw that urban and regional markets moved at sometimes an almost perfect opposite, and this should dispel the notion that the housing market as one moves in particular directions and should really highlight the fact that we need to look at housing submarkets because they do function with those separate dynamics and often show markedly different responses to the same set of changes or same set of shocks to the system. So this, importantly, housing in Australia is often kind of seen as a black box and housing policies is applied at a state or nationwide level. This research should help highlight the need for geographically differentiated housing policy that considers housing submarkets. Furthermore, the research highlighted the power of combining multiple national housing data sets to get quick real-time trends on housing market dynamics. And this should again be an important recognition of the need for a national integrated fine-scale housing data set to assist policy makers with housing policy by supporting up-to-date real-time housing market trends. That's one of the aims of the Australia Housing Data Analytics Platform, which I know several people are working on at City Futures, and this should just be another sort of argument for the importance of that kind of work. Finally, the work looking at the investor analysis highlights the power of investor sentiment and decisions in influencing rental and housing markets in Australia, and particularly given Australia's highly financialised housing market, where there are a number of components of housing and tax law that serve to structurally sort of advantage investors. It can be seen how much renters are at the whims of the decisions of landlords. So this, I guess, adds another argument to the debate about the potential need for systemic housing reform in Australia to address some of those components that structurally advantage investors. But I'm no expert on that, and I know there are several people at City Futures who are much more qualified to speak about that than me. So I'll leave that one for the experts and finish my presentation up there. Thanks for listening, and I'll take any questions.
So Will, thanks for that presentation. I think very insightful seeing what's happened with COVID and the sensitivities, it would seem, with some of those data sets and just how sensitive the housing market is, at least with the data you've got there for Sydney and New South Wales. You've got conclusions and implications, and I'm wondering if you had further thoughts whilst personally you've moved on to bigger in other things. What would you see, given the sort of the temporality, you've done this piece up to sort of 2021.
Yeah.
What would you think, just musing, what the sort of future next steps would be for taking this further?
So you mean taking the analysis further?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think an obvious first step would be to bring this analysis up to date. So a lot of the trends there were sort of starting to were contrasting the urban and regional rental market responses. But of course, we've seen since this analysis and moving into 2022 that urban rental markets have well and truly caught up with where they were before, and then have kind of pushed on to new heights. So I think the first step would obviously be bringing that analysis forward, because I think now we wouldn't see necessarily such a contrast. And we can see that there was a sort of quite a knee-jerk reaction from urban rental markets, but that's kind of corrected itself. In terms of the policy implications that we've got there, I think policy implications are not necessarily my forte, but I think it's interesting when you look at things like Airbnb regulation, because that's a very hot topic. And as I was saying, that's actually something which is being focused on by governments at the moment. So I think it'll be very interesting if and when those policies do go through to actually perform some sort of evaluations a few years down the track, and to see the impact those type of policies are having, because it's been a hot topic, but we're yet to see if those, the theory would indicate that I would expect that those type of policies would have an impact, but it'll be interesting to see whether that does happen, because as we've seen from the reaction to the COVID pandemic, the housing markets are very complex, and there's a number of different drivers. So yes, you can't necessarily just say have one policy that targets one specific area and get a particular response from that.
True.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Will. I'll open it up to the floor. Anyone who's here.
I think Chris Martin's got a question.
Yeah.
Chris, over to you.
But you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Am I?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Great. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Will. That's super interesting. I'm glad you're doing that, and you're joining up rental bond data with other things. That's and it's really striking to the vacancy rate and just how tight things have gotten in regional markets. I've got a question about, it was the point you made about investors buying in regional areas, and I think you were, I think the method you were using was finding where a property is it a property gets purchased and then turns up in the rental bond data subsequently.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, I'm also wondering about whether there have been people buying properties and they're turning up in Airbnb directly. And is there a way of tracking them? I mean, you've spotted them in the rental bond data. Is there a way of getting them in the Airbnb data?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Chris, and actually it's something we'd love to do. Unfortunately, the way I was tracking properties from the property market into the rental market was basically just using the geolocation of the property, matching it, to a certain decimal place in both markets, and then doing a basic check of some other features. Unfortunately for the Airbnb, the AirDNA data that we got, which is from that web scraping company AirDNA, obfuscates the exact location of properties because they have some privacy laws. So you basically get it within about 100 meters, which might serve some level of accuracy in regional areas, but in urban areas, it's not going to get you close enough to perform that geolocation match. So unfortunately, with the current level of data, we're not able to do that, but who knows if that will increase. And it absolutely would be an interesting, it'd be a very fascinating analysis if we were able to match it. But
fair enough. Another thing, I'll just chuck this in because it's something I saw in, it's another data source. It was, and I think I mentioned it the last time I did a City Futures seminar presentation. There was a big turnover in properties in regions in the pandemic period, and you can see it in the ABS residential price index series, and they've got a measure of property turnover, and there's a regional property transfers took off, and it fits in with it's consistent with the story you're telling, but it also it's also making me think, is there something going on just with the way properties change hands, and whether it's owner occupiers that just a different owner occupiers just take up more space when they move, or that it's consistent with the story, but I think it might open up some other reflections for you. It's this big takeoff in people changing properties, exchanging properties in the regions.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not something we included there, but when we were looking at that investor buying, we were also, one of the things we were looking at was just the total volume of purchasing that was happening. And we saw that right across the board, the volume of property sales essentially increased, but it was particularly prominent in those regional areas. Yeah. So it's something we had a little look at, but I don't think we quite sort of considered the, I guess, implications of we considered the investors purchasing, but we didn't kind of take a deep dive into who was buying those properties. So it's something that would be very interesting to look at. The paper's actually it's been submitted, or we're about to resubmit it, so it might be a bit late for this particular paper, but it's definitely a very interesting point, and something that, you know, if we did do further analysis, would be very worth a mention, I think.
All right, well, I'll look forward to seeing it when it's out. Well done. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Hazel.
Just picking up on the discussion that just occurred, when I was looking at your graphs, I was thinking, you know, Airbnb probably doesn't explain all of these differences, and the thing that came to mind for me is second homes. Mm-hmm. So people from the cities buying a second property to live in during the pandemic or some of the time. And I'm wondering if there's any data sets available, or any of the data sets you have now might give you some insight into those second home purchases.
It's a really good point. And yeah, I mean, I guess we touched on it a bit with those lifestyle kind of migrational changes, but it's not something we looked at particularly with our analysis.
The tax office has that data, and it's been written up in a number of RBA bulletins. So.
Right. In terms of second home
data.
Yeah,
multiple.
That's a really interesting point.
By age of household. So the tax office definitely has that data, but I'm not sure if it's.
Trying to get access to that data is another story.
It is something, at the very least, it would be a good thing to mention, actually.
Also,
just second home. Yeah.
You might want to cross-check the intra-state migration trends, as well as with the current census as well, to see that the population movement out of the Laura has a question. Will any thoughts on whether you could do the sales Airbnb analysis for a small regional case study using more manual methods, for example, matching photos from sales listings and Airbnb listings? Obviously hard to scale up, but could be a starting point for understanding how places are.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. I don't see why we couldn't do that. Definitely be manual, but it is an interesting perspective, and I don't know if I've got the time to go through and do that. But if there was like a junior able to do that, then actually it's a estimable way to sort of at least get a bit of a micro view, given that kind of, you know, the focus of the paper was the macro, but then also the micro. That could be, even if you just wanted to do those two sort of like case study areas, it could be interesting idea. Yeah, thanks, Laura. There's no more questions. Also, Bill, is there anything you wanted to add to that, or to respond to any of the questions?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay, Timmy. Thanks for that. It was actually really useful to remind me what we did in the paper, and very well presented it was too. Yeah, no, not. I mean, what this shows really is a couple of things. One is the value of having these sorts of data available. And I think, a couple of the questions were, could we do more? Could we do different? What's out there? And the answer is, there really isn't. The capacity just isn't out there to do these sorts of analysis to any great extent. I mean, this piece of work was done, I wouldn't say it was done cheaply, but it was done relatively quickly. And we were doing stuff which, to boldly analyze stuff that had never been analyzed before, if I can paraphrase another quote. So it does show the value of having that sort of data set where you can match case level material together, particularly the piece of work that Will did looking at rental yields and the shift of those, the numbers of sales that ended up being rented. I think that was a really interesting piece of the work, and only really started scratch the surface of that. We did try to look at the other way, the ones that were rented and then have been sold, but that was just not possible to do with the data we had. So there's some real value in the sorts of analysis here, but I also think it does show some real housing policy implications, and the fact that housing markets are not big black boxes that you just whack a policy on at one end and expect it all to filter through in some sort of grand filtering mechanism. Just doesn't work. These are very spatially specific outcomes. It does highlight where Airbnb, it is a myth, that is perpetrated by some folks, that Airbnb has no impact on local housing markets. That's nonsense. And these sorts of analysis show that to be fairly clear. Yes, there are some short-term impacts, clearly, as a result of the COVID, but it does highlight the integration of housing markets. They're not just, there's a rental market here and a sales market there and an apartment market over there. They are integrated, and it does mean housing policy. There are people certainly in our centre who would doubt whether we have a housing policy nationally anyway, but housing policy needs to be cognizant of these integrated outcomes in the housing market. So those are sort of closing comments, but again, go back to the point that without the information, without the data, this sort of stuff would never be possible. So a bit of a call out for the Australian Housing Data Analytics platform that Will referred to, that we're trying to work on with a whole range of interested parties at the moment. These are sort of things that should be available to policymakers and researchers and others to do this sort of work more generally. So a first stab at this. Whether we'll ever be able to do it again, I don't know. Will's now a much, he's employed in a proper job, presumably raking a massive salary and all the rest of it. So we'll never be able to afford him again, but I hope there's some younger folks coming through who will be able to replicate some way what he's done. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, I just want to add Bill's point, and Bill raised a very interesting point. Airbnb is likely affect the rental housing market, and what your finding is suggests that they might have a various impact regional area and the urban area in the center. There is a different types of rental price changes and yield changes. I just wonder, you mentioned that we need stronger Airbnb regulation. We might perhaps need peri-urban, urban area might need slightly different Airbnb regulation to encourage rural or peri-urban area more easily access to Airbnb, and urban area is vice versa. So do you have any thought about that existing regulation, whether it's address existing this sort of issue and get so on?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting point about, different regulation. I think, speaking to what Bill was talking about there with, trying to actually geographically differentiate housing policy, I think it's very wise to consider your Airbnb regulation for different areas, because when you look at places like Bondi or Byron Bay, you can see that if Airbnb ends up taking up in the Airbnb share, I think for Bondi, the Bondi postcode was about 25%. So you can see there that that is a hugely material impact, and fluctuations in Airbnb will directly impact the rental market. So, and similarly for Byron Bay. So I think that there absolutely needs to be a consideration on the scale of Airbnb's impact in an area, and the exact numbers of how many days, or if that's even the right sort of lever to pull in terms of restricting Airbnb, should absolutely be considered at a local level. Because we haven't done, or I've done a little bit of research on the literature about the positive impacts of Airbnb, and I mean, it shouldn't be all doom and gloom. So if there are places where it's got a less invasive sort of impact on the housing market, then it shouldn't be the one policy that's just swept across all housing markets. So yeah, I think absolutely there's a need for geographic differentiation and consideration of to what degree it affects it.
I think geographically too, you've picked obviously two very big hotspots.
Yeah.
Both international destinations for tourism and domestic tourism, that obviously the property prices too in those areas have skyrocketed. So yeah, I guess further research too would be to look at, you talk about those other housing submarkets regionally and across Sydney to see, what the different responses are.
And we were even talking in another paper about, here we're looking at tourist Airbnb activity, but of course you've got you've got business, other cases like business Airbnb tourism. Even here in Parramatta, there's been a little bit of research on Airbnbs cropping up for the business purposes, short-term stays for business trips. So yeah, absolutely there to inform suitable Airbnb and or other housing policy, there needs to be research into the specific effects it's having. Yeah.
There's another question from Colin Penter in Perth. Can you say a bit about the implications of these findings for rental reform at a government level to benefit private rental tenants in urban and regional areas, for example, residential?
It's a tough question. I might pass that one over to Bill, because I think he might be a bit better qualified to speak about rental reform and tenant rights than me. Bill, do you have any thoughts?
Yes and no, but we do have an expert on this, of course, with Chris Martin, who's online. I don't know whether I should bat it over to Chris to ask his opinion.
Keep going, Bill.
All right, I'll hang myself then. Look, yes and no. I mean, there are moves to restrict Airbnb, for example. We've heard some of them to restrict the amount of days that you can let it out. Obviously, there's a case to be made there. It may squeeze some of the players out of the market who rely on sort of 100%, 365 days a year or whatever it is, lettings to make it stack up. That may have an impact. And I think in Byron, if you limit it to 90 days a year, you probably find quite a lot of investors who had Airbnb would probably withdraw, because they may not be able to sort of make enough money to make it worthwhile. Look, I think that's a really difficult question, certainly for me to answer. Whether you would be talking about better security of tenure for existing tenants, so their properties don't get transferred into these short-term lettings markets, might be something. But I've not heard, Chris may have a different view, not heard too much that people get evicted and the thing gets turned into an Airbnb. But I think there's no question in certain areas that there's a transfer between this long-term and short-term lettings market as tenancies turn over, and as we've seen, vice versa. No, I think my overall view would that state governments need to better understand the dynamics of the rental markets that they're dealing with, so they do understand that there's a relationship between the two. I didn't get that feeling in the recent moves in New South Wales on short-term lettings at all. It was, if anything, done without any regard for the broader context in which this thing takes place. So other than that, I'm sorry it doesn't answer your question, but that's probably the best I can do. If others may want to chip in. Sorry, Colin.
Shall I have a go, Bill?
Yeah, go on, have a better go than that, I'm sure.
No, I've just done some research with Laura and others for a hurry that gets into this question a little bit, and it's about, I think, about how properties exit rental, and in particular that the exit that is opened up by Airbnb and the short-term letting platforms. And we really do have the way we do housing in Australia, it's very permissive of properties leaving rental. We've set up our private rental sector in a way that allows landlords to disinvest whenever it suits them. And Airbnb is one. Is another, as I say, now broadened prospect for properties exiting. And I think we need to, in terms of policy responses to that, instead of accommodating these exits or accommodating landlords being able to leave the sector whenever they like, when it suits them for Airbnb or to sell or whatever, instead put tenancy rights and people's housing rights at the centre of the policy development, and it may mean that having some other restrictions or other regulation of the way property is used, and the use can be the use is changed. That may be the thing that has to follow from putting people's housing rights at the centre.
I mean, I think it's a good point about the flexibility of the rental market, but it's flexible the other way. You know, you can move your home into a rental if you want to, just as quickly as you can take it out, more or less. And so, you know, that's one of the positives, if there's anything, about the current housing market we have. I wonder what the impact of things like build to rent might have on this issue down the track. Whether or not you could legislate about, I'm reluctant to suggest anything like this, but I mean, this is an issue for the tourist accommodation sector as well. Of course, they've been up in arms about Airbnb taking business away from them. Whether there's a movement in that area which could do a sort of build to rent for. In the same way that for tourist accommodation, short let accommodation, we already have those, of course, but not. I don't know what kind of scale it is in these, particularly in Sydney or Byron Bay, for that matter. I think it's a really difficult one. Without getting into the issue about trying to constrain people's freedom to do what they want with the property that they own, and I think then you get into all sorts of conceptual, political, and I don't know, moral questions, which is probably way beyond me and possibly way beyond the context of this particular discussion.
I was just going to say one more thing. I think it's worth mentioning, Bill, you were
Closing
talking
remarks.
Oh, yeah. Talking before about Airbnb landlords, you know, if you have tighter tenancy rights being potentially pushed out. I think it's worth mentioning that in a lot of the sort of early text on Airbnb that were sort of focused on the potential positives of the informal economy and solving some sort of cleavages in the housing market where people were undersupply meant that people couldn't get cheap informal housing. It was very much touted as the use case being people, you know, giving off a spare room or using
correct.
Airbnb while they were away on holiday. But of course, we see that it's completely evolved, and that is a tiny portion of the market now. And these investor landlords are the much more prominent part. So I think, like to say, if we lose those investor landlords, that's the loss. Well, really, that was never intended. That was never what Airbnb was intended to be. And of course, now Airbnb would very much recognises the profitability of that. But if we go back to what that sharing economy nature was originally touted as, you know, it was never meant to be sort of full-time investors. So I think if that's the loss that good regulation has, it shouldn't really be seen as a major loss if it means better tenant rights and whatnot.
Yeah,
I guess if you look at
really
these
good question.
Platforms too, like the gig economy and even Uber and Airbnb, they started off being quite affordable platforms. You catch an Uber now, and it's likely you'll pay more for an Uber than you will for a taxi.
Yeah.
And likewise, Airbnb properties are, not like you're saying, well, like a cheap bedroom
Yeah.
in a house. There, you go on and there's luxury houses for thousands of dollars.
One more question.
Last question.
Last question, Reg Wade. Do we have any idea of how many days per year the average Airbnb was being let for in these areas? Any visibility on how many of these are full-time listed as short-term rentals in the AirDNA data?
The answer is yes. Laura Cromlin did some research. I know Laura did some research on this, on the sort of getting a full-time Airbnb metric. And we also did in a paper that we presented last year. I can't remember the exact figure, but I think it was something like about 60% from memory were more than 90 days a year. So it was like I might be botching the figures there, but
I think you're about right.
it was a significant proportion where, I would say anything over 90 days is beyond what you could reasonably expect that someone just happens to be out for the year, well beyond that. So yeah, it was definitely more than not were the sort of in that class of investor landlords, I'd say.
Okay, well, this has been a great discussion, actually. There's been a lot of really good questions and discussion. So thanks again, Will, for your presentation.
Pleasure.
Much appreciated you coming in. Lee, Rupert, do we have any information on the next seminar in a couple of weeks that you want to share?
Sure, yeah. So our last seminar for the term is in 2 weeks. It'll be Hazel and Michael Tees will be presenting. I assume we're back at Kensington campus for that, but I guess we'll see about that. But yeah, so last one for the session for the term is in 2 weeks.
So we'll look forward to that one. Thanks everyone for joining us for our City Futures seminar. Thanks again, Will.
Thanks, guys.